Hi everyone, Kim here. I'm going through Ephesians chapter 3 at the moment, and I'm up to verse 13. So if you've been watching any of the other videos, this is a continuation as I go right through Ephesians. And I'm just going to go through one verse, Ephesians chapter 3, verse 13. Therefore I ask you not to lose heart at my tribulations on your behalf, for they are your glory. I'll read that again. These are the words of Paul to the Ephesian church. Therefore, I ask you not to lose heart at my tribulations on your behalf, for they are your glory. This is a funny little verse, and it's one of those verses that if you're reading the Bible, you would probably skip right over this verse, but it's actually loaded with significant stuff, significant truth, and so I want to have a look at it, and I'll just look at this particular verse. He says, therefore, I ask you. The therefore is there, and it refers to the section that's come before this particular verse. If you look at Ephesians chapter 3, verse 2 to 12, you find that Paul has described the ministry that God has given him. He describes it as a stewardship. In other words, he's been given responsibility to, having been enlightened by God about the good news of Jesus. His responsibility is actually to bring that message to light, the message of Jesus. Now, in this context in Ephesians, he talks about the message of Jesus, or the gospel, as being given to the Gentiles. In other words, that the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, have been included in Jesus. They, instead of being excluded, they are completely included, and that's a theme that has run through part of Ephesians 2 as well. Now, he describes the ministry that he's been given, and then the riches of what it actually means to be given Jesus and to be a partaker in the promise that's in him. And then he goes on to say that his job is to reveal the administration of God, or the stewardship of God throughout all generations. In other words, God's eternal purpose. So we find that Paul is saying that he and the other apostles have been given a message about Jesus that has to do with God's eternal purpose. Now, to talk about his eternal purpose means that it is a very solid, permanent purpose that God has, that he has brought about in Christ, and therefore the message about that is super significant. And it is because of that, the gift of Jesus and the message about that he says, therefore, I ask you not to lose heart. That expression, to lose heart, the phrase lose heart, is made up of two Greek words, the word in and the word bad. In bad. And so sometimes it's translated to lose heart, sometimes to grow weary. And we know what that feels like, because it's something that happens internally, where we become despondent, we lose motivation, we just lose a sense of hope inside. In other words, inside us it just goes bad. And so it's sort of like an internal flop. And he says, don't lose heart because of the truth of the gospel. So often we give much authority to what is happening inside ourselves and how we're feeling inside ourselves. And sometimes feelings can come up based on stray thoughts and what have you, or thoughts that have been said to us, or thoughts that the enemy has said to us, and inside our heart just sinks. And Paul says, no, keep your eyes on. It is actually your responsibility, because notice he says, I ask you not to lose heart. He's not saying here, pray that you won't lose heart. He's actually acknowledging the fact that it's our responsibility not to lose heart. And the way we don't lose heart is by keeping our minds and our thoughts on the truth of this solid, permanent, eternal, wonderful grace, freely given provision that we have in Jesus. That's basically what Paul is saying to us. Don't lose heart about it. Don't let your insides be transformed by anything other than the actual eternal truth of the good news of Jesus and the hugeness and the riches of what it means to be joined with Jesus and to be a partaker of him. But he goes on in verse 13, he says, "Therefore I ask you not to lose heart at my tribulations on your behalf." Now, often we'll lose heart about something that's happened to us, but here Paul is talking about the Ephesians losing heart on the tribulations that are happening to him. These tribulations are happening on their behalf. Now, Paul's tribulations, the difficult things that he's going through, and that word tribulation there has to do with outward pressure, the circumstances on the outside that have happened to Paul. And at this time, Paul is in prison because of the gospel, because he's been charged with proclaiming the good news of Jesus everywhere, and particularly amongst the Gentiles, including the Ephesian church. Because of that sort of thing, he's been imprisoned. He's been chased, and basically that's the idea of being persecuted, to be chased after by the Jews, and they've sort of knocked up charges against him, if you like, and then he's been put before the Romans, and the Romans have made him prisoner, and he's under house arrest at this point while Ephesians is being written. And that's why he says, "My tribulations on your behalf." Now, most of us won't relate to this sort of thing that much, because when we received the gospel, it was through maybe a preacher, maybe a friend telling us about Jesus, maybe we read about it in the Bible, maybe the gospel we've received, maybe we've received it over a long time through books, through things we've read, through people we've heard, all sorts of places. So we tend to think of our source of the gospel as being all over the place. But for the Ephesian church, they had Paul rock up one day and start to just speak in the public sphere and proclaim the gospel, and suddenly the people found that they were convicted in their hearts, and they knew the truth of the gospel of Jesus deep within them, because God was at work by God's grace toward them. And so the church suddenly was born at Ephesus, and Paul stayed with that church actually over quite a long period of time, close to 3 years, I think it says in Acts. Paul says in the book of Acts. So everything, their gospel had come to them through the example and the teaching of Paul. So he was their main source initially. And now this significant servant of Jesus was suddenly imprisoned, which would have really disheartened these guys, because they're basically going, "Oh no, this seems like the end of something," because this one through whom the gospel has come is being shut down, basically. Again, we're not used to it. We don't think like first century Ephesian Christians. We think from our own perspective. But I guess any circumstances that become really difficult, any things we hear about that where significant Christians, people who have been significant in our own lives, and when something happens and suddenly they're persecuted or they're crushed or they're closed down, or if something else happens in our lives that crushes us in some sort of way, we can become discouraged in our hearts. Maybe it's we've shared something about Jesus with someone and they've shut us down, or they've ignored us, or they've judged us in some ways, or they've gossiped behind our backs, whatever it might be. And it's suddenly become this external pressure that has caused us to feel like, oh no, the gospel is somehow failing in some way. But in this case, he's talking about his tribulations that he's going through. Now, for Paul, the gospel being proclaimed and tribulation basically go together. The gospel and tribulation and suffering go together, and that's important to understand. Jesus said it would happen in John chapter 15. He says, "If they persecute me, they will persecute you." In Matthew 10, he says, "If the world hates me, it will also hate you." In other words, Jesus is saying, once you're included in me, when you will be included in what I do and how I live, that will actually start coming out through your life. And the world reacts to me because the world is completely different from me. And it will also react to you. He says in another place, a student is not above his master. In other words, if they do something to a master, they will certainly do it to the student of that master as well. And the apostles lived this out in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verses, I think it's 1 Corinthians chapter 4, 9 to 13, it might be 2 Corinthians. Paul talks about the nature of just weakness and the difficult places that the apostles often found themselves in. They were treated really badly for the sake of Jesus, because they had on their tongues and they lived out in their lives the life of Jesus and the word of Jesus. And Paul is saying to us here in Ephesians, don't be discouraged. Don't be discouraged when the suffering comes, when the persecution comes, whether it comes through a significant Christian that we've known in the past, whether it comes to us in our own lives. Don't let your hearts become discouraged because of the significance of the gospel that's actually going out. And he says this tribulation has come to him. It's on their behalf. And he says, and it's for these tribulations are your glory. So this is the last bit of the verse. They are your glory. Again, we don't often make the connection between suffering for being a Christian and glory. Glory, of course, has to do with I'm not sure how to put this in really shorthand. Glory has to do with status. It has to do with value. It has to do with it's a relational thing in the New Testament. Glory is basically when it comes to Jesus, Jesus has the glory of the Father. In other words, the Father loves him and the Father's always with him. And that's the glory of Jesus. Jesus is always glorifying the Father. He's always speaking of the Father. He's always doing the will of the Father. And this, as Jesus lives for the Father is glorified through that. So basically he's saying that Paul's suffering, the fact that he's willing to actually suffer for the sake of the gospel, and the gospel is for them, that's actually their glory. Now that's in two ways. One of it tells the Ephesians how much they are valuable to God. God commissions Paul and the other apostles to proclaim the gospel, and the fact that they're willing to go through immense suffering tells us that we are valuable to God. But secondly, the actual outworking of the gospel in our lives, as Paul and the other apostles speak out the gospel and we hear it, and for us it's through the scriptures, we find that gospel actually has an impact on us, and we find that we have a restored relationship with God through the gospel of Jesus, and we find that as we relate with Jesus, we find that his life and his truth start to shine out of our lives as well. The scriptures talk about this glory, and it's a glory that increases in glory each day as we learn more and more about Jesus and relate more to him. As who he is has an impact on our lives, we reflect him more and more. But the scriptures also talk about the fact that one day in the future, Jesus will return, we will be raised up to him, and we will instantly be transformed into such a form that will reflect his glory beautifully and fully. And we will see him face to face, and we will be like him, the scriptures say. I've spoken about this before, but it's such an important event when we fully display his glory. So as Christians, we can look for glory to all sorts of other places and try and get our sense of okayness and lovability and value from the things we do and relationships we've got. We can try and go there, but all of those places are not an echo or a shadow of the real glory that comes from God and comes through union with Jesus as his life impacts us and his word impacts us, and we end up shining his life out through us. So and the suffering and the glory are strongly connected, always, because when we suffer for Christ, it is a sign and an indicator that we're actually living for him and living with him. If we are his, we will suffer, and the suffering is actually a sign that we are his, and the suffering is a sign that because we're his, we will share in his glory. That's the picture. Now, main point of this verse, to summarise, is this. There is such a profound, massive, eternal significance about being joined with Jesus that we are not to lose heart about the difficulties we go through for the sake of the gospel, or the difficulties that others go through for the sake of the gospel. We are not to let our heart be dragged down and become bad inside, if you like, or become tired, hopeless, and that is in our hands, and the way we do that is by keeping our eyes on the hope that we have in the gospel, in being joined with Jesus, and the glory that is connected to it, and in fact the glory that is connected to suffering for the sake of Christ. So if somebody gossips about you because of something where you stood your ground regarding the truth, if you looked silly in some situation for the sake of Christ, understand that the suffering that comes from that, the way that people will look down on you sometimes, the way that people will speak about you sometimes, the fact that people will sometimes step away from you and avoid you or reject you, or make a premature judgment about you, or classify you in some way that is derogatory and negative. The fact that that happens is a sign that there is glory to come, and all of this is through the gospel of Jesus. Okay, I think I'll leave it there. Take hold of the massive truth. It's funny sometimes because we think that how we feel on the inside about something, we feel like that's real, and sometimes the truth is just abstract. It's the absolute opposite way around. How we feel on the inside is transitory, it's temporary, up and down and up and down. The eternal things have to do with the gospel of Jesus and the reality of what God has done in Christ and our joining ourselves to him. So I hope that encourages you. I hope you have a good day. Bye-bye.